For a long time, I thought the hardest part of getting old was the body. The knees that don't cooperate the way they used to. The mornings when getting out of bed requires a negotiation with yourself that you don't always win. The doctor's visits that multiply and the pills that accumulate on the kitchen counter like a small pharmacy nobody asked for. But I was wrong about that. Those things are hard, but they're not the hardest part. The hardest part is something nobody warned me about. The hardest part is the afternoon. 4 o'clock in the afternoon when the light changes and the house gets quiet and there's nowhere to be and nobody expecting you anywhere, and you're sitting in your kitchen with a cup of coffee that's gone cold, and you realize you've been sitting there for 40 minutes without moving. Not because you're sick, not because you're sad exactly, just because the day has gone quiet in a way that has weight to it. My daughter Susan called me last year. She asked how I was doing, and we talked about the usual things, and then at the end of the call, she asked me something that I've been thinking about ever since. She said, "Dad, do you ever get lonely?" And I said, "No," automatically. The way you say you're fine when someone asks how you are. The word came out before I'd even considered the question. She said, "Are you sure?" And I said, "Yes, I'm sure." And then I hung up the phone and I sat in my kitchen in exactly that 4 o'clock quiet, and I thought about what she'd asked me for about 2 hours. And the honest answer, the one I didn't give her because I didn't have it yet, was that I genuinely didn't know, because I had spent so much time filling the quiet that I had never actually stopped long enough to find out what was inside it. That question started something in me that I want to talk about today, because I think a lot of you are sitting in your own version of that 4 o'clock kitchen. And I think some of you are doing what I did for years, filling it. Television, radio, errands that don't need running, phone calls to people you don't particularly want to talk to, just to have a voice in the room, just to not be alone with the quiet. And I want to tell you what I learned when I finally stopped filling it. After Margaret died, I didn't handle solitude well. That's the honest version of what happened, the version I don't usually tell because it's not a flattering picture of a man who spent 62 years in manufacturing, thinking of himself as someone who could handle anything. What actually happened was this. I sat in her chair. For months I sat in her chair because sitting in my own chair felt wrong without her in hers. I kept the television on from morning until I fell asleep at night, not watching it, just running it. The noise of other people's voices in other people's living rooms, so my living room didn't feel so completely empty. I left the radio on in the kitchen when I wasn't in the kitchen. I would run errands that didn't need running because a grocery store has people in it, and people make noise, and noise felt safer than the alternative. I was not dealing with solitude. I was running from it. And the running was exhausting in a way I didn't fully recognize because I was too busy running to notice how tired I was. What broke the pattern was something small and accidental. The power went out one evening during a storm, nothing dramatic, just a Florida thunderstorm doing what Florida thunderstorms do. And suddenly everything went quiet. No television, no radio, no hum of appliances, just the rain on the windows and the dark. I sat there in the dark for a long time, expecting to feel terrible. That was what I had been protecting myself from after all. The quiet, the empty space, the absence of Margaret that lived in every room of this apartment. But something unexpected happened. My breathing slowed down. My shoulders, which I hadn't realized were up around my ears, dropped. And in the quiet, I could hear things I had been drowning out for months. The rain against the glass, a car going by outside, my own heartbeat, steady and ordinary, doing what it had been doing for 87 years without asking my permission. And for the first time since Margaret died, I wasn't fighting the quiet. I was just sitting inside it. I didn't learn everything that night. You don't learn things like this in a single night. But something shifted. Some small understanding began that has been growing ever since. And I want to tell you what I've learned because I think it matters. I think it might be one of the most important things I've figured out in all my years. And I figured it out embarrassingly late. Here's the first thing. There is a difference between loneliness and solitude. I know that sounds simple. I know it sounds like something you'd read on a card at a gift shop, but I mean it in a specific way that took me years to understand. Loneliness is when you feel abandoned, when the silence tells you that nobody needs you and nobody is coming, and you are somehow less because you are alone. That's what I felt in the months after Margaret died. Not the aloneness itself, but the story I was telling myself about the aloneness. That it meant something was wrong, that it was a wound, that I was unfinished somehow. Solitude is different. Solitude is when the quiet stops being an accusation and starts being just space. Room to think, room to breathe, room to exist without performing for anyone or managing anyone or being needed in the particular ways that you've been needed your whole life. I spent most of my adult life needed in very specific ways. Margaret needed me to be present, to be steady, to be the person who fixed things when things broke. My kids needed versions of that too. The factory needed me to show up and do my job. I was needed so constantly and so specifically that I had never had to ask who I was when nobody needed anything. That question terrified me when it first arrived because I didn't know the answer. After 62 years of being Henry who shows up and Henry who provides and Henry who fixes things, I was sitting in a dark apartment during a thunderstorm and the question was sitting there with me. Who is this man when nobody's watching? The second thing I learned was about the voice in my head. And I want to be honest about this because I don't think men talk about it enough. The voice I'm describing is the one that runs underneath everything, the commentary, and mine was not kind. After Margaret died, after I retired, after the children stopped needing me daily, that voice had a lot to say. It said things like, "You're not useful anymore." It said nobody calls because you've become someone people feel obligated to, rather than someone people want to talk to. It said you had your time and it was fine and now it's mostly done. I would not say those things to another human being. I would not say them to a man I disliked. But I said them to myself in the quiet of 4 o'clock, and I called it reality. I called it being honest with myself. But it wasn't honest. It was cruel. and it was making the solitude unbearable in a way that had nothing to do with the solitude itself. The quiet wasn't the problem. The voice I brought into the quiet was the problem. I started doing something that felt foolish at first. When the voice said something like that, I would answer it out loud, like talking back to someone who's being unfair. I would say something like, "You worked 62 years in manufacturing and raised 4 children and loved your wife for 58 years, and you're still here getting up every morning. That's not nothing. That's actually quite a lot." It felt ridiculous. A man in his 80s talking to himself in his kitchen in Fort Lauderdale. But here is what I found out. When you live alone, your own voice is the loudest voice in your life, which means it had better become a decent one. Because if the loudest voice in your life is unkind, you are living in a hostile place, and that hostility is coming from inside the building. I got better at this slowly. I didn't wake up one morning and suddenly speak to myself with warmth and patience. It was more like learning a language, uncomfortable at first, then gradually more natural. But it changed things. It changed the quality of the quiet considerably when the voice inside it stopped being my worst critic and started being something closer to a fair witness. The third thing I learned was about the body. Not fitness, not exercise in the way younger people mean it. I mean something simpler. I mean staying connected to the physical world. Because what I found in the months when I barely left the apartment was that my mind started turning inward in a way that was not healthy. The world shrank to the size of my living room, and inside that shrunken world, every small discomfort became enormous, and every fear had nowhere to go but around and around. What stopped that was simple movement, getting outside, not for exercise, not to accomplish anything, just to be a body in the world instead of a mind in an apartment. I started walking to the coffee shop on Saturday mornings, not because I needed the coffee, because the coffee shop has people in it, and the walk there has morning light in it, and both of those things remind my nervous system that I am still a person in a world, and not a ghost in a box. I started spending time in the small courtyard behind my building, where there are some plants that aren't mine, but that nobody objects to me sitting near. I sit there in the morning sometimes, and I do nothing in particular. I watch whatever there is to watch. A bird that visits the same branch at the same time most mornings. The light on the concrete when the sun gets higher. These are not impressive things. I know that. But they matter more than I can explain to someone who hasn't been through the particular darkness of staying inside for months because the inside felt safer than the outside. Because what I found outside was that the world keeps going regardless. Trees don't know that Margaret is gone. Birds don't know that I'm retired. The morning light arrives the same way it arrived when I was 30. And there's something steadying about that, something that puts your particular grief in a larger context without dismissing it. The fourth thing I learned was about curiosity. Frankie called me once, maybe 2 years after Margaret died, and he said, "Henry, what are you interested in?" And I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "Just what it sounds like. What are you interested in right now? What are you curious about? And I didn't have an answer, which frightened me more than I showed him, because for 62 years I had been interested in my work, and then I had been interested in being a husband and a father and a provider. All of that was legitimate. All of that was real, but it was interest in service of something external. And when the external things changed, I discovered that I hadn't developed much interest that was simply mine. I started small and I started accidentally. I found a book about the history of manufacturing in America that I'd bought years ago and never opened. I sat down with it one evening thinking I'd read 10 pages and bore myself to sleep. I read for 3 hours, not because it was exciting exactly, but because my mind, which had been half asleep for months, woke up to encounter something it didn't already know. That was the beginning. After that, I started looking for things to be curious about the way I used to look for things to fix. Not grand things, not important things necessarily. I watched a documentary about the ocean floor that had nothing to do with anything in my life. I read about the history of Tampa, the city I'd lived near for decades, and found things I'd never known about places I'd driven past 1,000 times. Dave came over one Thursday and I told him what I'd learned about Ybor City, and he sat at my kitchen table for an hour listening and asking questions. And at the end he said, "Dad, you seem different." And I said, "Different how?" And he said, "I don't know, more like yourself." I think what he meant was that I was interested in something again. And a man who is interested in things is more present than a man who has run out of things to be interested in. Curiosity is not something you have when you're young and lose when you're old. It's something you practice or abandon, and abandoning it has consequences. The fifth thing I learned is the hardest one to explain. I learned that being alone is not the same as being without. This took the longest because the feeling of loss after Margaret died was so specific and so large that for a long time everything felt like absence. The apartment felt like absence. The evenings felt like absence. The mornings felt like absence. I was so aware of what wasn't there that I couldn't feel what was. What shifted it, gradually, was paying attention to what actually was there. Not trying to be grateful, not performing contentment I didn't feel, just noticing. The coffee in the morning that I made the way I like it, without anyone's preference to consider but my own. The particular quiet of early morning before Fort Lauderdale wakes up. The Thursday calls with Dave that had become something I genuinely looked forward to rather than dreaded. Sarah brought me a plant last spring, a small thing in a green pot that she said was hard to kill. She was right. It's still alive, which is more than I can say for the plant I had before it. It sits on the windowsill in my kitchen, and I talk to it sometimes the way I used to talk to Margaret while she was cooking. Not conversation exactly, just talking, the way you do when you're thinking out loud and someone or something is there to think out loud at. It's a small life in some ways. I know that. Smaller than the life I had when Margaret was alive and the children were young and the factory needed me 5 days a week. The radius of my world is smaller. The number of people in my daily life is smaller. The noise level is considerably smaller. But here's what I want to say to you clearly and honestly because I think it needs to be said. Small is not the same as empty. That took me years to understand. I was measuring my life against the version it used to be and finding it lacking, which is a way of making yourself miserable that I highly recommend avoiding if you can, because the comparison is not a fair one. A life at this age is not a diminished version of a life at 40. It is a different kind of life entirely. Different things matter. Different things are possible. Different things bring satisfaction. At 40, I was satisfied by productivity, by completing things, by moving forward on visible tracks toward visible goals. At this age, I am satisfied by other things, by a conversation that was genuinely honest, by learning something I didn't know before, by the plants still being alive on the windowsill, by the particular quality of a Saturday morning when I have nowhere to be, and I sit with my coffee and the Fort Lauderdale light comes through the window, and I am simply here, simply present, simply still. That is not a lesser satisfaction. It is just a different one. And it took me too long to stop mourning the old satisfactions, long enough to notice the new ones. So here is what I want to say to you. To whoever is sitting in their own 4 o'clock kitchen with their own cold coffee and their own questions about what this part of life is supposed to feel like. Stop running from the quiet. I know it's frightening. I know it has things in it that you'd rather not face, but it also has something in it that you haven't found yet. Something that was always there, but that you could never hear over the noise of everything the younger years demanded from you. Talk to yourself kindly. You've earned that at minimum. You've been through things. You've loved people. You've lost people. You've gotten up more mornings than you can count from more difficult nights than anyone else will ever fully know. You deserve a voice in your head that acknowledges that. Get outside, not to exercise, to remember that you are a body in a world and not just a mind in a room. The world keeps going. It's worth being part of it even in a small way. Find something to be curious about, not something useful, something interesting. The difference matters. And understand, really understand in a way that gets past the words and settles somewhere deeper, that being alone is not the same as being without. Your life is not empty because it has become quieter. Sometimes the quiet is the gift. Sometimes the later years are when life finally gets honest enough to be worth paying attention to. I'm Henry Walker. I live alone in Fort Lauderdale. I drink my coffee in the mornings in the same chair. I talk to a plant on my windowsill. I call Dave on Thursdays and sit in my courtyard on mornings when the light is good, and I have become, slowly and with considerable difficulty, something I wouldn't have predicted 20 years ago. I've become comfortable in my own company, and it turns out that's not a small thing. It might actually be one of the largest things there is. Tell me in the comments where you are with this. Are you running from the quiet or learning to sit in it? Because I think more of you are in that 4 o'clock kitchen than are willing to say out loud.